7th India Studies webinar we are starting today. Today, December 21st, we're doing a bit early because of the Christmas break. And thank you so much to our guest speaker today, all the way from Maryland, USA, United States of America, Dr. Neha Sahgal. And my distinct pleasure to welcome her. Her and her team's great work, I think, really clarifies several misconceptions and stereotypes about Indian religions that we all have had for decades now, including so-called scholars on religious studies. When we study and talk about Indian religions, I think we all have strong opinions, but it's really hard to find an alternative to such a groundbreaking research work that Dr. Neha Sahgal and her team has done. So without further ado, let me read her bio and then I'll invite her and then she'll present her talk. So Dr. Neha Sahgal is Associate Director of Research at Pew Research Center, specializing in international polling on religion. She is involved in all aspects of survey research, including designing the questionnaire, monitoring fieldwork, evaluating data quality, and analyzing results. She is an author of studies on the religious beliefs and practices of Muslims around the world, Christian-Muslim relations in sub-Saharan Africa, religion in Latin America, religious divisions in Israel, religion and national identity in Central and Eastern Europe, and the role of religion in Western Europe. She has been invited to speak about the project's research at universities, religious organizations, and governmental agencies such as the US Department of State and the European Union. She also talks about the center's findings in international print and broadcast media. Before joining the Pew Research Center, she worked at the Asia Foundation in San Francisco. She received a doctorate in government and politics with a concentration in the comparative politics of the Middle East and South Asia from the University of Maryland in 2008. Such a wide and deep areas of literally in geographical areas and religious studies areas that she has covered over the years. I'm really, really happy to have her and welcome her, Dr. Sahgal. All yours. Welcome again.
Thank you, Dr. Jain, for that kind introduction. Well, it's very wide, but I don't know how deep it is, so I'll leave that up to your judgment. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have a PowerPoint today. I promise not to bore you with a million slides, but it's sometimes difficult to talk about data without actually showing it to you. And one thing that Dr. Jain didn't mention is when we began some of our initial research to do this project, and this was several years ago now, maybe 3 years ago, we actually spoke with him on the phone to get to benefit from his wide expertise in this topic area, and that consultation was actually very helpful as we planned the project. So what I'm going to present to you today are the results of a public opinion study that Pew Research did in India on the topic of religion. This is the single largest study we've ever done outside of the United States. And the reason we did a very big study in India was because of how diverse this country is. And to really understand some of the complexity that characterizes religion in India, we felt we needed to go kind of go big or go home. And that's how we kind of approached India. But first, a little bit about the Pew Research Center. We are a research organization. We do not take any policy positions. We are not pro any political party, we're not anti any political party, and we do not make any normative statements. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to stick close to the data. I'm going to tell you a story based on the data, but I will never make a statement about whether something is good or bad or desirable or not desirable. I won't make any anti-government or pro-government statements because I just don't think that that is something that the data can speak to. And that is up to you as a consumer of this data. Our primary funder is the Pew Charitable Trust. We also receive funding from other philanthropic organizations. Particularly for this study, we received funding from the John Templeton Foundation. And my goal, and the Pew Research Center's goal in presenting this data to the public, is to enrich the public dialogue and ground public debate in a set of facts. There is one normative position that we do take, and that is that a good democracy and good governance deserves good data. And data should be the basis for public discussion and policy making. And that is about the only normative statement that I will make. Here are some of the technicals of this survey. We completed nearly 30,000 interviews with adults all across the country. The field work was conducted before the first wave of COVID-19 hit India. So that was toward the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. We wrapped up field work just as COVID-19 was ramping up. Interviews were conducted in 17 Indian languages. Respondents were selected through random sampling. And so the data that I will present is basically from a sample that we drew, but the results can speak to actually all Indians. There are some exclusions, however. Kashmir Valley was inaccessible at the time we did this survey, and Sikkim and Manipur shut down already because of COVID-19, so we were not able to do interviews there. So bear those in mind as you digest some of the results. The interview itself is very long. It's about 45 minutes with each respondent. So I'm not going to show you all of the results today. I'll just show you some of the highlights. And if you're interested in more, please do ask in the Q&A, because it's quite possible we did probe more on your question, and I would encourage you to take a look at the full report. It's over 200 pages long, and if you're having trouble sleeping at night, this could save you a trip to the doctor. So there's that as well. Here is the religious composition of India per the 2011 census. This is just the adult population. I'm not showing you children because we do not interview children in this study. Obviously, the vast majority of the population is Hindu, but you do have a sizable Muslim minority, and then other groups have a much smaller presence, including Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. There are a number of other religious groups in India besides these six. There are Zoroastrians, there's Baha'i, and it's important to note that we included these groups in the total number of interviews. However, we do not have enough interviews with Baha'i and with Zoroastrians to be able to separately talk about their opinions. So whenever you see breakdowns by religion on public opinion in India, you'll see the six main religious groups up to Jains. However, we did interview Baha'i, etc., and their attitudes are represented in any numbers that you see reporting on all Indians. So what is the story of religion in India? The data points to two things going on at the same time when it comes to religion in India. On the one hand, Indians express a high level of commitment to the principles of tolerance, right? And we see this borne out in a number of ways. At the same time, they desire living highly religiously segregated lives. These two things happening at the same time might seem to contradict each other. They might seem antithetical, but to Indians, they are not. And that points to the fact that Indians' model of pluralism and how they have built a plural society differs considerably from what we know to be true in other countries. So one good example is the United States aspires to be a melting pot of many different ethnicities and religions, and that people mix together. And that is the aspiration per the United States. Canada strives to be a salad bowl society. People mix with each other, they retain their identities, but they mix with each other. But Indians seem to aspire to a society that resembles more a patchwork quilt with clear lines of separation among religious groups. Or if we were to carry on with the food metaphor, which for some reason is very popular when we're talking about models of pluralism, the Indian model of pluralism is a thali. Everybody together in the same plate, however, everybody remains separate. And those lines are very important for Indians. But while the desire for religious segregation exists simultaneously with a commitment to tolerance, we also find that segregation in Indian society is tied up with some of the fault lines we see in India today in attitudes toward politics and identity. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break down each of these three buckets a little bit more and show you some of the results and some of the public attitudes that we picked up on in India. Beginning with tolerance, shared values, and beliefs. We generally find that Indians say they are very free to practice their religion. Hindus, who are the majority of the population, overwhelmingly say they feel very free to practice their religion, but India's religious minorities also generally say that they are very free to practice their religion. That includes Buddhists, Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, and so on. We also find that Indians express a high level of commitment to the principles of tolerance. They overwhelmingly tell us that respecting all religions is very important to being truly Indian. So 85% of Hindus say this, 81% of Sikhs say this, Buddhists also say that respecting all religions is a very important part of being authentically Indian. They also tell us that respecting other religions is an important part of their own religious identity. So to be a Sikh, it is to be truly a Sikh, it is very important to respect other religions. Or to be a Muslim, you must respect other religions. So tolerance is seen as a national value. It is also seen as a religious value in India. We also find that there are religious beliefs and practices in India that seemingly cross religious lines. And so when we ask people if they believe in karma, 77% of Hindus say that they do, but so do an identical share of Muslims. Now, karma is, of course, not theologically a Muslim belief. It's not mentioned in the Quran, yet we find that this particular belief seems to have crossed religious lines. Of course, you may say that karma is a pop culture belief. I mean, it's widely prevalent in Bollywood, even Hollywood, so this is not a surprise. So to be sure, we also asked about the purifying power of the Ganges. Now, this is a quintessential Hindu belief. And not surprisingly, 81% of Hindus say they believe in the Ganges' power to purify, but so do roughly a quarter of Muslims and about a third of Christians. Once again, pointing to the fact too that in India, these religious beliefs have crossed religious lines. At the same time, we find that Indians perceive themselves to be very religiously different from each other. So when we ask Hindus in India, how much do you have in common? And do you think you have a lot in common with Muslims, or do you think you're very different from Muslims in India today? We find that 2/3 of Hindus, 66%, say that they are very different from Muslims in India today. And not only Muslims, they also generally think that they are very different from the country's Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains. Similarly, Muslims return this sentiment. Nearly 2/3 of Muslims say that they are very different from the country's Hindus, and similarly, they feel that they are very different from the country's other religious groups. And that's not just true among Hindus and Muslims in India. These are the two larger religious communities. We also generally find that India's other religious groups generally perceive difference when it comes to their relationship with other groups in India. They say that they are very different from others. So another good example is Christians, who say that they are very different from Muslims. 62% say that they're very different from Muslims. Of course, theologically, Islam and Christianity have a lot in common. But this does not seem to affect this opinion or this perception of difference. There are some exceptions. The majority of Jains see a lot in common with Hindus, and among Buddhists, among Sikhs, generally Sikhs say that they have a lot in common with Hindus. But overall, these are the exceptions. The perception of difference in India when it comes to religion far outweighs the perception of commonality. And this perception of difference is not just about theoretically, right, kind of what's similar and what's different. We also find that Indians today live highly religiously segregated lives. They feel very much against interreligious marriage. And we ask people, how important is it to stop women and men in their community from marrying outside their religion? Generally, people said that this is very important. So 2/3 of Hindus, for example, said that it is very important to stop Hindu women as well as Hindu men from marrying outside Hinduism. Right? Among Muslims, this sentiment is even more pervasive. Nearly 80% of Muslims said that it is important to stop, or it is crucial to stop the interreligious marriage of Muslim women as well as Muslim men, showing that Indians generally, not only do they feel it against interreligious marriage, they think that it's very important to actually stop interreligious marriage. And it's not just about interreligious marriage. We also find that Indians tend to keep their friendship circles confined to their own religious group. They tell us that either all of their friends share their religion or most of their friends share their religion. And that's true not just of Hindus, with a vast majority of Hindus saying that their friends are nearly entirely or mostly Hindu, but it's also true of other smaller religious groups. 80% of Sikhs, for example, who are just a small sliver of the population, even for them, friendship circles remain confined to their own religious group, once again pointing to the high levels of segregation along religious lines in Indian society. Now, most people don't go so far as to say that they want to live in a religiously segregated neighborhood. Still, there is a substantial minority of people who would rather keep certain other religious groups out of their neighborhood. So 36% of Hindus say that they would not be willing to accept a Muslim as a neighbor. 31% of Hindus say they wouldn't want a Christian as a neighbor, and just above a quarter would not want a Sikh, Buddhist, or a Jain neighbor. Muslims tend to return this sentiment. Roughly a quarter or slightly more say they wouldn't want a Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, or Jain neighbor. And even among other religious groups in the country, a substantial minority would not want a neighbor of another religion. By no means do these shares reach a majority. The one exception are Jains, where 54% would not want a Muslim as a neighbor. But generally, it's not a majority, but these are not insignificant numbers. Right? There are a substantial share of people, Hindus, Muslims, etc., who would rather live in a religiously segregated neighborhood, who would not be willing to accept people of other religions in their neighborhood. And what implications does this segregation, or this high level of segregation, have for India's national identity and its Indians' views of politics? Well, for one thing, we do find that for the majority of Hindus in India, being a Hindu and being truly Indian are closely intertwined. Nearly 2/3 of Hindus in India say that it is very important to be a Hindu to be truly Indian. Closely related is the role of language. 59% say speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian. Now, Hindi, of course, as you all know, is one of dozens of languages spoken in India today, but Hindi seems to have a special status in the minds of many Indians. These two attitudes, being the relationship of religion to national identity and the relationship of language to national identity, are closely intertwined. Those who say being a Hindu is very important to being truly Indian also tend to say that speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian. Altogether, roughly half of Hindus take both positions. They say both being a Hindu and speaking Hindi is very important to authentic Indian identity. And these attitudes are inherently political in that they are closely tied up with how people vote. So if we take a look at the results of the 2019 parliamentary elections, overall, about half of Hindus say they voted for the BJP, which is the ruling party in India. But BJP's vote share varies considerably based on people's attitudes about national identity. So among Hindus who say it is very important to be a Hindu, to be authentically Indian, a majority say they voted for BJP. But BJP's vote share falls considerably among those who see some connection between religion and national identity, but just not as strong. And then finally, BJP's vote share is much smaller among people who don't see a connection between religion and national identity. And if I were to show you this bar chart by attitudes on the Hindi language, you would see the exact same pattern. Right? BJP's vote share being much stronger among those who see the Hindi language being closely tied up with Indian identity. And that speaks to the fact that three things in India today are highly intertwined: religion, language, and politics. And altogether, we find that 30% of Hindus take all three positions. They say being a Hindu is crucial to Indian identity, speaking Hindi is very important to being truly Indian, and they voted for BJP. So 30% take all three positions. Right? This 30% is a distinctive group of Hindus. Right? Their attitudes differ from other Hindus in India today. The regional distribution, in particular, can vary quite a bit. They are much more prevalent in the central and northern parts of the country, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Himachal, etc. They are much less prevalent in the southern part of the country, so Kerala, Tamil Nadu, etc. There you get into much smaller shares. They are more religious than other Hindus. And one factor that consistently differentiates this group from other Hindus in India today is how they feel about religious segregation. And this brings us back to the story of religious segregation of India, where we began. in that segregation does have implications for India's politics and India's national identity. Hindus who voted for the BJP and they associate the Hindu religion and Hindi language with true Indian identity tend to live a much more religiously segregated life. Nearly half of them would not be willing to accept a Muslim as a neighbor. They are also more likely than other Hindus to say they wouldn't want a Christian, Sikh, Buddhist, or Jain in their neighborhood. A majority of them say all of their close friends are also Hindu. And this sentiment that the interreligious marriage of Hindu women must be stopped is a lot more widespread among this group. So it's a much more religiously segregated group than other Hindus. Let's take now a deeper dive into Hindu identity in India today and what it means to be Hindu to Indians. Overall, we find that India is a believing country. It's a religious country. Nearly all Indians, or unanimously Indians, say that they believe in God. That's 97%, including nearly 80% who are absolutely certain about their belief in God, but 80% of Hindus being absolutely certain about their belief in God. Why do I bring this up? Well, one question that scholars of religion and society nearly always ask around the world is, what are Hindu beliefs about God, right? Do Hindus believe in one God, many God, which God, right? And it all seems so difficult to understand, right? And even for many Hindus, this is so difficult to understand, right? About pantheism in Hinduism, or what are Hindu beliefs about God. So we thought, rather than relying on theologians, etc., to explain this to us, why don't we ask Hindus, right, what they believe about God? So we asked Hindus, and as well as other Indians, if they believe in one God, or if they believe in one God with many manifestations, or if they believe in many gods. And generally, we find that Hindus say that there is only one God with many manifestations. Very few Hindus actually say that there are many gods. And some, about 30%, actually say that there's only one God. Now, this is quite different from what generally is popularly bandied about in the literature, that Hindus believe in many gods, that it's a polytheistic religion. So actually, in many Hindus' minds, that's not actually true. And interestingly, for many Muslims and Christians as well, I mean, this is in direct contrast, because for Muslims and Christians, the majority of them believe in only one God. Still, roughly 1 in 5 Muslims and Christians do say that there is one God, but with many manifestations, right? So perhaps, again, we see some bleeding over of Hindu ideas of God into Indian Islam and Indian Christianity. So, of course, there may be one God with many manifestations, but what about all the different gods, right? In Hinduism, I mean, there are millions of gods in Hinduism. So we thought, let's probe this a little bit more. So the way we did that was we presented all our respondents with a show card, or like basically a big card, and it had pictures of 16 Hindu gods. And here I'm just showing you 7, but actually there were 16 on the card. And we asked people to tell us which God you feel closest to, and they could pick up to 3. So if you're looking at the results and you're a little bit ahead of me and you're like, wait a second, this doesn't add up to 100, that's actually why, because people could pick more than one. And the Hindu God that got the most votes for being the God that people feel closest to is Shiva. So Shiv got 44%. Of Hindus saying that they feel closest to Shiv. Hanuman came in behind Shiv, and then Ganesh, but this varies a lot regionally. These are just the national results. So since I am virtually in Maharashtra today, I will point out that Ganesh got the most votes in Maharashtra, and that's not a huge surprise. In the northeast of the country, we had Krishna with the most votes. So the Hindu God, of course, but however, nationally, Shiva is the most popular Hindu god. But while many Hindus do tell us that they believe in God, they're absolutely certain about their belief in God, we also find that in India today, for many Hindus, believing in God is not central to Hindu identity. So we ask people, can a person be a Hindu if they don't go to temple, if they don't pray, if they don't believe in God? And about half of Hindus said that a person who doesn't believe in God cannot be a Hindu. But the other half said that that's fine, right? Believing in God is not central to Hindu identity. We did, however, find that a majority of Hindus said that a person who doesn't celebrate Hindu festivals cannot be a Hindu, a person who celebrates Eid cannot be a Hindu. And the one attitude that for most people disqualifies a person from being a Hindu is eating beef. 72% saying that this dietary restriction, more than even theological issues like God or praying or temple, is central to Hindu identity. And this attitude varies quite a bit regionally. It's much more prevalent in the north and the central parts of the country, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, etc. It's much less prevalent in the south of the country. So very central importance of this dietary restriction to Hindu identity. I want to end with a little bit on Muslim identity in India today. This is a topic that often comes up in public discussion and in the media. And this survey does give us, because of the large sample size, it does give us an opportunity to break down a little more about Muslim identity in India today. Generally, we find that Muslims in India today are highly enthusiastic about Indian culture. 85% agree with the sentiment. Indian people are not perfect, but Indian culture is superior to others, including 63% who completely agree with this sentiment. So we find across many measures, not just this one, a high level of patriotism among Indian Muslims. We also find that generally the vast majority of Muslims in India do not tell us that they have recently faced discrimination because of their religion. 1 in 5 do. 1 in 5 tell us that in the past 12 months, they have faced discrimination because of their religion. Now, this is a matter of interpretation. You could see 20% as a lot, because that means potentially one person in every family has faced religious discrimination in the past 12 months. That could seem like a lot to you. Or you could say that 80% have not faced religious discrimination. Number can be interpreted either way. However, it is worth pointing out that the share of Muslims who say that they have experienced religious discrimination does vary considerably regionally. So in the north of the country, which includes Delhi as well as Rajasthan, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, 40% say that they have faced discrimination in the last 12 months. Now, we were doing in the field with this study when some of the protests around the Citizenship Amendment Bill were in full swing. So some of these results may have been affected by that. We also find that perceptions of discrimination are generally higher in the Northeast. 36% of Muslims in the Northeast say that they have faced recent religious discrimination. But it's worth putting this number in context. Generally, feelings of discrimination, not just among Muslims, but among all religious communities, as well as among all caste groups, are higher in the Northeast than elsewhere in the country. And so this is just a general pattern in the Northeast, where perceptions of discrimination are just more widespread or more acute in that part of the country. One issue that has politically been quite charged in India is the status of Muslim courts. So Muslims in India do have the option of going to their own religious courts to solve civil disputes like inheritance or divorce cases. The decisions of these courts are not legally binding, and they can be challenged. If either party is not convinced by the decision, they can then take their case to a civil court, right, rather than a religious court. But this issue has really come up in Indian politics, as should Muslims be allowed to go to their own religious courts even for civil cases. And we find today that among Muslims, the vast majority do support this provision for Muslims to go to their own religious courts. 74% say that they should be allowed to go to their own religious courts. But this issue has become a fault line in India today, because among other religious communities, the support for allowing Muslims to go to their own religious courts is much smaller. Right? And generally, among other religious communities, people are opposed to this provision for Muslims. But speaking of fault lines, I mean, one issue in the history of Hindu-Muslim relations in India that is seemingly evergreen is the partition of the subcontinent into India and Pakistan. So it's been nearly 75 years since the partition and since independence. And so we thought we would ask people if they think that the partition of India and Pakistan was a good thing or a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. And Muslim public opinion, 70 some years after the partition, generally sees the partition of the subcontinent as a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations. About half of Muslims say that partition hurt Hindu-Muslim relations in India. But Hindu public opinion is more divided, and it leans in the opposite direction, with Hindus generally saying that the partition was a good thing over a bad thing for Hindu-Muslim relations in India today. So again, between Hindus and Muslims, this seems to be a real fault line. Our perceptions of this historical event do seem to differ quite a bit. And the one religious community where a majority of people see the partition as a bad thing for communal relations are the Sikhs. 66% of Sikhs saying that the partition hurt Hindu-Muslim relations. And of course, we have to remember that Sikhs have a particular history with the partition, and Punjab in particular has a history with the partition, with the Punjab being divided actually between India and Pakistan. That brings me to the end of some of the highlights from this study. But as I mentioned to you, these are just the highlights. There's a lot more in this study that I didn't cover today. And in particular, I'll point to a few things. We did look at caste in this study. We looked at caste discrimination. We looked at attitudes on caste segregation. And we also looked at religious conversion, and particularly the conversion of lower caste Hindus to Christianity. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to answer those in the Q&A. We looked at quite a bit at religion and food. We looked at regional differences among Hindus. I alluded to some of that in my remarks. Happy to talk about that more in the Q&A. For this and a lot more, I would encourage you to go to pewresearch.org/India survey. And I appreciate your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sahgal. It was really eye-opening, and I was chuckling all the way. So many things that reinforced my stereotypes about India. So many things were dispelled by your report. So both were really interesting and learning experience for me also, and I'm sure for many of the participants. So let's invite any questions if anybody has any questions, you can type in the chat window or Q&A window. To start with, I guess I can probably ask my questions. I have 5 or 6, 7 points I noted while listening to you. First question if there are anybody else, please type in the chat window. If not, I will start with my question. There is, what did you see in you have traveled and researched across the world from your bio that I learned today. And so do you see any different stark uniqueness about the work that you did in India versus elsewhere?
Yes, I mean, I think one thing worth pointing out is India is a religiously segregated country. That's without a doubt, especially when you compare to other countries. Segregation by religion is very stark. I don't mean to say that India is unique in its segregation. It is unique in its religious segregation. So the United States is a very racially segregated country. So, and Israel is an ethnically segregated country. So, you know, sometimes it's sort of the same story, just a different angle. But this is what makes India unique. It's the religious segregation. So that's what I'd point out. On the flip side, some of the religious syncretism in India is unique. So, you know, this is a good example to bring up because I'm sitting right now in the United States and Christmas is around the corner. And, you know, every Christmas or every other Christmas, there's always some controversy about Christmas, right? So, you know, whether it is the store saying Merry Christmas and then people are offended that why is it Merry Christmas? It should be Happy Holidays, or it shouldn't be Happy Holidays, it should be Merry Christmas. So the status of Christmas is always people offended, right? One way or the other. So it was a surprise for many Americans to learn that for Indians, celebrating Diwali, regardless of religion, is not a problem. So many people celebrate Diwali, right? Muslims who are celebrating Diwali, Christians who are celebrating Diwali, particularly in some regions, Hindus who say they go to gurdwaras, particularly in the north of the country. And, you know, this is kind of wait, what? For a lot of Americans. But I don't want to whitewash, because I mean there are controversies about this in India as well. I mean, we did see in the results that a big portion of Hindus did say, if you're celebrating Eid, you can't be a Hindu. Right? And similarly saying, if you're celebrating Christmas, you can't be a Hindu. So there is some debate about this in India today. Nonetheless, some of the syncretic practice in India and syncretic belief in India makes it unique.
Super. All right. There are no other questions, so I'll go with my second question. Any particular more serious implications? You touched upon some implications, but do you see any serious, because of the segregation, do you see any serious fault lines that are really, that should be alarming to all of us, or not yet? What's your...
I mean, I would hesitate to put a value judgment on it, on how serious this is, just because that's a judgment call, right? I mean, that's up to you.
Yeah.
The data does show that segregation is very much has implications for Indian politics,
Okay.
right? And it very much has implications for Indians' views of their national identity. So the more segregated people are, the more they seem to lean in a particular political direction. So for Hindus who live more segregated lives, they are much more likely to not want a Muslim neighbor. They're more likely to vote a certain way. They're more likely to feel that Indian and Hindu identity is closely tied together. So, there are certainly political implications and implications for Indians' views of their national identity. Whether those are serious implications or whether they are negative implications or positive implications, that I leave up to you.
There is a question from Professor Aparna Shankar, my colleague at Pew University. Were there any differences in attitudes towards yoga and meditation by religion? That's an interesting question.
Yes, great question. I'm so happy you asked it. We did ask about both yoga and meditation, and particularly when it comes to yoga, I mean, most Hindus don't do yoga, and they don't. And they don't even do it on a monthly basis. So there's a stereotype of India being the land of yoga. Perhaps that's true to some extent, but it's not true to the extent that people think. And actually, most Hindus are not the group that have the distinction for being the most likely to be doing yoga either. And that distinction actually falls to Sikhs and Jains, who have higher shares of people doing yoga than Hindus do. So, even the theological roots of yoga may be in Hinduism, but actually today there are other religious groups that are more involved with yoga than Hindus. And actually, a colleague of mine actually wrote a blog post just on this topic. So if you just type into Google yoga and Pew Research, you'll actually find it if you're interested in the results.
So interesting, so interesting. I have a comment actually, Dr. Sahgal, with your permission. The issue of segregation that you have highlighted in your report, you and your team, it reminded me of one interesting phenomenon I'm going back 2,000 years of history, and I remember reading somewhere that when Jews came to India, the eastern coast of India, the Kerala is where they came. So when they came, they were left alone. So they can practice, they had complete freedom of religion of the way they practiced. And so that segregation aspect seems to be inbuilt into the DNA of India. Well, whatever they are doing, it's their complete freedom. We will not interfere. So maybe that kind of a patchwork that you notice in your opening slide also, that's probably inbuilt, that probably it also applies to different castes. So whatever caste they have their own ways of marriage, ways of rituals and everything. Let's not interfere. That might be the historical, tradition, but of course now it can lead to some political implications.
I think that's actually a really good way to put it. Like, segregation has been part of Indian history perhaps for a very long time.
Exactly.
But now we're living in the 21st century, and perhaps maybe now it has more political implications than it ever has.
Ghettoism, and yes, that's very, yes. All right, another question from Dr. Manish Mehta from Michigan, my friend, last old friend. And so question is, were respondents queried on their philanthropy and service to humanity? That's a great question, really. Were respondents queried on their philanthropy and service to humanity and or animals or environment? How do the trends turn out? It's a great question. I don't know if you
Yeah, this is a really good one. We did ask people if they are donating to charitable causes through their temple or their gurdwara or otherwise. And yes, I mean, we do see a lot of commitment to donating. It's pretty strong among Muslims. That's not a big surprise just because zakat is such an important pillar of Islam. We also see it among Sikhs. It's a very and we knew that like among Sikhs is an important part of the Khalsa, right? So you do see that bearing out in the data. Um, about conservation issues in animals, I know Dr. Jen, this is an important topic for you. So we didn't get too much into conservation, but we did ask a question about whether God can be manifest in nature, right, and in animals and in nature. And among Hindus, this is a very common belief. It's also common among some Muslims. Now, of course, for a lot of Muslims, this is blasphemous, right? I mean, you can't have like manifestations of God like this. But again, now we know, right? Indian Islam is Indian, okay, and it's a very unique Islam, right? Elsewhere, like it's unrecognized. Probably, if somebody in the Middle East or somebody were to see Indian Islam, they would not even recognize it, right? Because it's so unique, right? Indian Muslims believe in karma. Quarter of Indian Muslims say the Ganges has the power to purify. Some are saying that there's one God with many manifestations, and some are saying God can be manifest in nature and rivers and trees and so on. So this is the unique characteristics of Indian Islam.
Yes. Wonderful. Yes. All right. Any other question from my participant? If not, I have my own list here. As I was listening to her, I kept writing here. So yeah, another question I had was, did you find any difference in the way your India report or India survey was received vis-a-vis your other reports? Was the response more enthusiastic here or it was similar I'm just curious about this.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. I thank you for asking it. I mean, I've done a lot of work in Europe and I've done work in the United States. And, part of in Europe and the US is a very strong appetite for public opinion data. And it's very common, right, to find public opinion data. There's hundreds of institutes doing similar kind of work. So in that sense, there's an inbuilt market for this kind of work, and the media already is very well versed with reporting on public opinion data.
You trust me, everybody knows.
And so we have like a reputation there that we could sort of bank on. So in some ways, it's a little bit easier, right, to do work in the US and in Europe, but it's more satisfying in places like India, because India, there's just not that much quantitative data on this topic, right? There's CSCS, an Indian think tank. We know that think tank very well. We're very inspired by their work. But that's about it, right? I mean, other than that, I mean, and especially in the public debate, there's very little data. There's in the academic debate, yes. But so we really saw an opportunity in India to make a unique contribution, because this topic is so politically charged, right? And this topic is so personal for so many people. And the public debate in India is very much, it comes from a place of emotion. And that's largely because people talk about their personal experiences, and that is the basis for the public debate. That is not wrong, because that's very important, right? But that's not the only way to have a public debate, right? In fact, if people tell their personal stories, then by definition, the topic becomes very emotional. But if we were to put data in the public debate, then suddenly the debate becomes more dispassionate, which is a contribution, right? Because then we can have different personal experiences, which is completely valid and fine, but we can still talk on the basis of fact. And here's the fact, right? Here are the numbers in conversion. Here are the numbers on caste. And you and I can have a discussion based on the same numbers. Whereas if you're talking about your personal experience and I'm talking about my personal experience, that's it, right? There's no common basis for the discussion. So in that sense, we felt that Indians reacted with a lot of enthusiasm. There was almost like a hunger for this kind of data, to debate this data. And we also felt that, and I think you were pointing this out too, Dr. Jen, when you and I were just conversing before the seminar, that members of sort of both sides of the political debate can, for the first time, debate this issue because they are using the same data and they're using the same set of facts.
So interesting.
So in that sense, like there's a way that you can inject data brings a level of civility to the public debate that I think is unmatched, right? And that's the contribution that Pew Research Center and I personally want to make.
Excellent. We have three questions. So we have some good participation now. So one is from Anup Tripathi. Was there any question on religion-wise preference for non-vegetarian food? How do different religious communities fare? I think you already touched upon, but you can.
Yeah, this is a good one. I mean, India is a country where food is very important to people, right? And it has like so much religious significance. And so for Hindus, the issue of beef is so central to Hindu identity, right? But it's not just Hindus, right? And for Muslims too, we ask the same question: can a person be a Muslim if they don't believe in God, if they don't perform namaz, and if they eat pork? And interestingly enough, for Muslims, the issue of pork is more important than the issue of believing in God, which is just a shock because for Muslims, belief in God is like the number one pillar of Islam, right? There is no God but God. You have to believe in God to be a Muslim. But for Indian Muslims, the diet issue far surpasses the God issue, right? So diet has become just so central to Indian identity and Indian religious identity. There are a number of other questions about whether people would be willing to eat in the house of somebody who's a non-vegetarian, or we've also asked gens about whether they eat root vegetables, etc. So that data is also all available.
Wonderful. There's one from anonymous attendee. I don't know what the name is of this person, but the question is: was there any question on religion-wise preference? Oh, same question, is it? Oh, sorry, yeah, the same question. Sorry. All right. Then next question is by Dr. Manish Mehta. Were attitudes of youth and young people towards religion and religiously varied? Are Indian youth more religious than Western nation? That's a great question also.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked it. I mean, generally we find in the US we find that younger people are less religious, right? And we find this in Europe too. I mean, they're much more likely to say they have no religion. They are less likely to observe religious practices. In India, we actually find there's not a huge difference between younger people and older people in their religious belief and their practice. So in that sense, yes, youth in India is more religious than youth in other countries, and India is just not showing the signs of losing its religion or becoming. I hesitate to use the word India is not secularizing, because secular in India has a particular meaning, right? It's a political idea. It's a political ideology. So I don't want to use that term, but so I use the term India is not losing its religion, right? Indians are religious. They don't show any signs of becoming less religious. And the youth does not show the lower levels of much. I mean, they're slightly lower, but it's not much, right? Compared to older people. We also know that people become more religious as they grow older. So some of this could also be a life cycle effect.
Okay, great. Awesome. One very small question I had when you were discussing, you were saying that Maharashtra has Ganesha as the number one. You use the word votes. So Ganesha got the largest number of votes in Maharashtra. What about North India, UP, Rajasthan? Is there special preference in UP especially?
Yeah, UP, I know why you're asking, because you're wondering if Ram was first in UP, and that's not true actually. Even in UP, Ram did not. I mean, in UP, Ram did fare better than elsewhere. Still, Ram was not number one in UP, right? So
Shiva still in UP also, in Shiva?
I believe it's Shiva in UP as well. Okay. I do have that data. I can look it up, but it was not Ram. But Ram did better in UP than elsewhere. But Ram is not the number one god. That's Shiva. So.
Wonderful. All right. Next question I have is, you pointed out that some Muslims, almost 20% in northern India, feel that they are discriminated against. What about Hindus? Do Hindus feel that they are discriminated in their own,
yes,
also in their country?
Yes, they do. And actually, Hindu attitudes toward discrimination for themselves are, I mean, Hindus see as much discrimination against their own community as they see against Muslims. So it's about the same, the same shares.
Okay. What about Jains and other minorities in India?
Yeah, Jains didn't see a lot of discrimination. Neither did Sikhs. Basically, when it comes to religious discriminations, Indians just don't perceive a lot of discrimination. And that finding was surprising to a number of people who thought that there is a lot of discrimination in India. but Indians just generally didn't see there. I mean, and part of that, part of that be that segregation is not perceived of as discrimination in
My
India.
last question from my list, last question, if I may, if there is no other questions, I'll just go to my last question, which is, I was really surprised to see many of your parameters, Buddhists and Jains were really quite different. But when we teach religions of India, we say shamanic religions are Buddhists and Jains, and then Hindus are Vedic. But in your report, again, that is also stereotype that is really dispelled. There's a lot of, why do you have any more to add? Why Buddhists and Jains?
Thanks so much for asking this. This is such an important question because, you go to college to study religion and you take your religion 101 class and you are taught Buddhism is like this and Jainism is like this, and here's the eightfold path, and then here's what this is the meaning of Kaivalya in Jainism.
Yes,
but when you start asking people about religion, when you start actually doing research on religion, you find it so much more complicated than that, than what you were taught in the textbook, right? Just one complicating factor. There are so many more is caste. Buddhists in India today are Ambedkarite Buddhists, right? They are converts. They have converted many years ago, and they are Navayana and Navayana Buddhists, who are vast majority of them are Dalits. And Jains are, the vast majority of them are upper caste. Right? They are very few Jains fall into scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, or other backward class. It's a wealthy community in India. It's one of the highest levels of education and highest levels of income. Buddhists are at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder because of their status, and then many of them are Dalits. So how that complicates the picture, right? Like, socioeconomic status is not divorced from religion in India. Caste is not divorced from religion in India. So many times, people's religious attitudes are indistinguishable from their caste attitudes and their socioeconomic attitudes. These things complicate the picture.
Right. Wonderful. Okay, that's all I had from my list. Yes, and we already took 51 minutes, but any other questions for Dr. Sahgal? If not, I think we are done. And thank you once again, Dr. Sahgal, and I hope your report will continue to be cherished for years and years until your next report comes when we do the next exercise. But until then, we thank you all on behalf of religious studies scholars and students. I thank you also for that part of the segment of the demographics. And of course, thank you from India. And you have any last words to add?
No, thank you for having me. I hope that many of you can use at least some of this in your classrooms with students and in your own research. I mean, that would be the biggest compliment for us. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Sahgal. Thank you. Goodbye. Bye for now.